And you are now live.
This is Senate Appropriations, and we're continuing our testimony on the governor's proposed FY 2023 budget. And we have with us now the Secretary of the Agency of Education and a number of staff as well. So, Secretary, if you want to introduce your staff and yourself for the record, and then we'll let you do the presentation however you have it arranged, whether you want a screen sharing or turn it over to someone else, it's however you want to do it. So it's all yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. It's good to see you all. I'm Dan French, Secretary of Education. Have members of the Agency of Education team, the AOE team with us, Bill Bates, CFO, who will largely lead the conversation. And we do have a slide deck that he can share at some point. Brad James, who you might be familiar with. Brad leads up a lot of our work managing the Ed Fund and so forth. Chris Case, who you might not be as familiar with. Chris is our Division Director of Student Supports Division, and we have a position request in the budget that pertains to his division, which is where special ed in particular is housed. And then Jill Briggs Campbell is a new rock star at the agency who's been leading up the management of our federal funds and does phenomenal work. So that's the team we brought with us today. I turn it over to Bill to sort of put up maybe a screen share of our presentation, and then I'll make some opening comments relative to the budget, then turn it over to him.
Okay, one last question. Brad, you're still on staff. Are you, do you have plans to retire? Did I hear that?
You did, but it won't be probably till I don't know when. I'm looking maybe November-ish.
Well, I don't mean to have you interpret.
You're trying to push me out.
No. It's like, no. I was just wondering, obviously you've got a body of knowledge that is hard to replicate. And so I was just inquiring if your plans were more near term or maybe subject to change.
They're always subject to change, but as I said, I'm looking, 10 months out at this point, and I'll still be around. I'm not going anywhere either. So when people have questions, I'll be around.
Great. Okay. Thank you. We'll start.
Okay. Yeah. And, Brad in particular, the question often comes up around the Ed Fund. It's not necessarily central to our budget conversation, but Brad, as you mentioned, has a lot of institutional wisdom, but specifically is directly involved in a lot of the Ed Fund questions. So we find it useful. He chimes in and contributes a lot to these conversations. Bill, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll make some introductory comments and turn it over to Bill, who's our CFO, Bill Bates. You can keep going, Bill. I'm going to get into the nitty gritty of it. I think you're all aware of this. We've organizationally been challenged and have been leading the better part of a pandemic response in our schools. So that's had implications on our organizational structure. I just wanted to speak directly to the position requests that are in our budget, just to highlight them now. We'll get into this in more detail. But we have two positions I'm recommending from general fund sources. One pertains to establishing a new kernel of a team that would pertain to school facilities, their health and safety. I had plans to move a position from another area of the agency to make this an initial two-person team. And I can speak to why this is an important strategic moment for us to do that. I'm sure you're aware we have a lot of policy work going on around school facilities and wellness and health and so forth, whether it be PCBs or sexual health. We have a number of initiatives, and we need to find a home for those activities inside the agency. And then secondly, the second position that I'm requesting pertains to our policy and communications team. A significant part of our response to managing the pandemic has been in this area of communications, and we've deployed new tools in that regard. I did add a third position to this team just internally, but I need a fourth. So that's the second general fund position request that's in the budget proposal. Additionally, we have three positions queued up, not from general fund, but from what we call Individuals with Disabilities Education Act funding that the state receives as a special ed funding. So that's one of the reasons Chris Case is with us today. If you have questions in that regard, we are seeking to beef up our special education oversight functions for a number of reasons. One is historically we've been weak in that regard, as identified by sort of a federal audit. Secondly, we're launching 173 implementation. This is going to be a fundamental shift in not only the funding source in special education, but for the practice of special education. So we need to have better support functionality. And then thirdly, we're going to be entering into sort of this post-pandemic moment, what we call education recovery, where we expect there to be significant additional need for student services. And we want to position the agency to be in a place to not only provide support and oversight, but also leadership for districts in that regard. So that's a summary of sort of the position requests. I'm going to turn it over to Bill to kind of walk through some of the normal detail of the presentation, but I'd be happy to speak to any of those issues as they emerge in the budget conversation.
Thank you, Secretary. Madam Chair.
Yes, go right ahead.
Thank you. For the record, Bill Bates, Agency of Education, CFO. And as Secretary French mentioned, we have Jill Briggs-Campbell with us today, as well as Brad James and Chris Case. What I like to do is start out with a high-level executive summary of our recommended budget for FY23. And you can see from this slide that we have, we're seeking $2.4 billion across all 12 appropriations, which represents a $355 million increase over FY22. The bulk of that is related to federal funds in the tune of $315 million, as well as $42 million for Ed Fund. If you look at the bottom line here, general fund, we're looking for just south of $800,000 of an increase in general fund. And as Secretary French mentioned, we're seeking 2 positions, which would represent 200,000 of that 800,000. Here's a executive summary of the positions that Secretary French spoke to. He highlighted the 2 general fund positions for safe and healthy school and communication policy. And then we're seeking the 3 special ed monitoring coordinators for Chris's team, and then a grants manager. Those 4 positions are all part of our federal funds. And then lastly,
Are those 4, those positions, is that a federal funding source that's grant, or is that an ongoing source?
These are ongoing sources.
Okay.
And then we're also seeking permission to use $500,000 in federal spending authority to utilize consultants to help support Jill and the overall COVID-19 response for the agency. Next, I'd like to walk you through a high-level overview of the agency operations. Start out with the agency org chart. No changes from last year. You can see that it's made up of the program side, which is headed up by Deputy Secretary Boucher. Then you have myself with finance and admin and data management. You have general counsel, and then you have the Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. Currently, we have 11 vacancies that we're recruiting for, and we have a total of 161 resources on staff.
Quick question, Madam Chair.
Yeah, it's good. Baruth, Senator Baruth.
This would be for Secretary French. Good to see you, Secretary French. It's been a little while. Just wondering, when long ago, when you came in for your meeting with the Ed Committee about your appointment, and we were going over the org chart, as you came in, it was quite empty in various places. Special ed, you mentioned, was cavernous and had taken some hits. I know that the presentation here is that it hasn't changed much since the last time you came to this committee, but I'm wondering, since that long ago time when you came in, what does the hiring situation look like now?
Yeah, it's good to see you too, Senator. Yeah, I think the dynamic's fundamentally different. I think, to your point about the cavernous nature of special ed, I think that's a great example. We had 25 vacancies when I came in, and there wasn't much hiring activity underway, which was the thing that caught my attention. And it was, my theory was it was precisely because we had a number of the major leaders, those positions themselves that normally would be in charge of the recruitment, were those positions were vacant. So we had, for example, in special education, we had the division director, the assistant division director, the state director of special education all go out on retirement, essentially very close to each other. So those positions would be directly involved in recruitment. So therefore, several of the line positions that normally would have been under active recruitment were not under active recruitment. So we were, I won't say paralyzed at that point, but we had a lot of work to do. And the question that I would often get in those initial months was like, what are you doing to get more staff? And I'm like, my simple answer is I'm trying to fill the positions I have first. We also had almost all except for one division director positions in the agency vacant. I also had a new general counsel, new CFO. So there's been a lot of change at the leadership level. That's much more stable than it was. I would qualify our vacancies now as sort of being the normal, if anything's normal during COVID per se, relative to recruitment, more the realm of a normal vacancies turnover. In the last couple of months, we've seen some folks leave who were extremely talented with the agency who have other aspirations, and that's always good to see. But we have some vacancies right now that we're actively working on that are now more in the pathways division, which is where our CTE programming is and some of the workforce issues. So that's a concern. But bottom line is a lot of the leadership positions are much more stable. And when we have recruitment issues, we're able to manage that pretty effectively. So I think, we've made a lot of progress in that regard. I think right now it's more of the pandemic moment. We're trying to figure out how to recruit and retain people, certainly leveraging more telework as a recruitment tool and a retention tool. But it's an interesting moment relative to recruitment and trying to find people across all sectors of the economy, including state government.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. That's helpful.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll keep moving on through with the slides.
Very well. Next slide. Simply, I wanted to highlight here that operations for the agency is really supported by two of those 12 appropriations that I made reference to. It's B500, which is Finance and Administration, and then B501, which is Education Services. And under B500, you can see that we have the Secretary's Office, Communications, Legal, Finance and Admin, and then the Data Team. And then under 501, which is Education Services, and that's headed up by Deputy Secretary Boucher. You have the programs, federal ed and support programs, student support, education quality, and student pathways. Drilling down one layer, this is a high-level overview of the budget request for B500, which is Finance and Administration. You can see that we're asking for total budget request of $35.8 million, which represents 1.5 increase or 1.5 million increase or 4.5% over FY22. And the key drivers, personal service, the increase in permanent temporary staffing, and then the internal service funds contracts for a total of $1.5 million. Next slide is going to show us how that is broken out and how it compares to FY22 by expense category. So if you were to look at personal services, operating expense, grants, and want to know how they compare to FY22, you can see the makeup of the $1.5 million. And then we slice it by funding source so that you can see, all right, of that total budget request of 35 million, how much of that is general fund, ed fund, and federal funds. And you can see for general fund, our increase in finance and admin is 597,000, which is the top line. Moving on, education services, which is B501. You can see that our FY23 budget request is 510 million, which is 312 million increase over FY22, or 157%. The biggest drivers there are the COVID-19 funds of 281 million, and then the increase in federal funds of 30 million. We also have 841,000, which is personal service. And then the three resources in Chris Case's team that Secretary French spoke about, line 4, for a total of 312 million.
Could you help us, prior slide, in the COVID-19 funding? You've been getting funding through ESSER. We have given some funding to support our schools through CRF. We've funded some, I think, through ARPA. Could you just tell us the funding of the COVID-19 funding stream that you're referencing here, or are there more than one?
So 268 million of it is ESSER 3, which is the LEA portion of that,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
which is the biggest component. And then, as mentioned,
So is that just a pass through to the LEAs?
that is, yes, that is money that is going to go directly to the LEAs.
Okay. Thank
Jill,
you. I
would
just
you
wanted to
like
be
to-
clear that I was attributing the funding to the right source.
Yes. And Madam Chair, we do have Jill Briggs Campbell with us as well, if there are specific questions related to anything COVID.
Well, I guess this is really ties into FY22. It may extend into 23 as well. And it's COVID related, but it's also gets into the realm of the CTEs. And we had money, the ESSER money can't go to the 3 independents. They can go to the other CTEs, but only if the LEAs feel generous about giving them money. So we dealt with that issue, and I'm going back to 22 because it's an issue that we're going to have to work out with the House, and now's a good time since you're here. The governor and your agency had proposed 1.5 million to be distributed across all the CTEs using an average head count per CTE. We had the 3 independents that came in and said their methodology was better, and they had identified a specific amount for each of them, which was a little bit more than, was over 500 million. And the biggest funding was River Valley.
500,000.
And then, so what we did was increase the 1.5 a little bit more to 1.725, and said, no, the CTEs essentially ended up in the same place in terms of funding. The independents just didn't qualify for ESSER, and the others might have qualified theoretically, but in reality, they didn't get funding except for limited, which was from the sheet that you provided to us. And oftentimes it was for a specific expenditure or whatever. It wasn't, meeting operating costs that continued, even though the student count was lower. So now we have the Senate basically saying, we want to make sure everybody benefits because they suffered from the same problem of not being, due to COVID, of not being able to recruit their students, et cetera. And we've had back and forth with the 3 independents. It appears like they want to have their specific amounts referenced and carved out, and then the remainder of the appropriation, it wasn't really clear, but I think what they were saying, then distribute the balance to the CTEs using, and it had to do with data that wasn't available, et cetera. So we have a difference with the House, who gave only money to the 3 independents, nothing to the rest. we're like saying, no, everybody should get some financial relief here because you ended up in the same spot just for different reasons. And then we've got this request for 3 to say, well, our methodology is better, give it to us that way. My question is, have you seen their methodology and the extent to which we should use that same approach for the non-independents as we try to figure out the amount of money? And we're proposing also to use Ed Fund, which I imagine will hit the buzzsaw once we get to the House. Although we view it as an education. You're laughing, Senator Baruth.
Just at the accuracy of what you're saying.
So can you help us in terms of understanding, is there a better methodology than the average? And it was, I think, the 3-year average that you gave us on the sheet, and we saw the percentage of the 1.5 and what that would translate to. And maybe now isn't the time, but we need to understand, and we want to be fair, and we want to provide financial assistance to more than the 3 independents, in contrast to what the House did. And so if there's data now available that can help refine the distribution, then that's great. But I'm going to, and if you want to follow up in greater detail, I'm going to ask Senator Baruth to be the contact person to help us figure this out. But that is our challenge as we try to negotiate the relief that we provide to our CTEs.
Yeah, Madam
Anything-
Chair, we'd be happy to
Yes.
help with that, certainly. It's been a challenge, as you mentioned. I think you nailed a lot of the detail on it. I will say the governor's prioritize use of gear funding to support the CT centers. So there has been some money available relative to COVID related issues. The tuition one is a little trickier because not all CT centers were affected. So we've heard that analysis and have some thoughts on it, but certainly we'd be happy to provide a summary to Senator Baruth of the committee and point you to a possible solution.
Okay, and we want to be fair.
Sure.
Obviously, and so we took more of the approach that you had proposed, but then we got immediate feedback from the 3 independents, and so we're in this midst of a pas de deux here with the House and the CTEs, and we just need to come up with some the best solution possible. Senator Baruth.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in that along with wanting to use a different methodology, at least one of the independents seemed to be arguing that they should be given the House's recommend, which was the broken out amounts for the 3 independents, and then a share of the additional money that would be left in our allotment. And they wanted to be competing for that equally with all the other districts. So it seemed like there was a form of double dipping that they were suggesting. So it's hard to know. Our original thought was just to have one daily membership that would create a metric. Everybody gets a formulaic amount, but the independents have a sort of 2-tiered approach to their own funding request. So your thoughts on that would be appreciated as well.
Yeah, I think, we can provide that more specific information and support your decision making in that regard. Happy to do that.
Okay, that would be very helpful because we're going to have we're going to name a committee of conference, and we need to figure out what's the fairest approach. And also to fully understand, are we talking about double, or are we really talking about if we did 1.5 or 1.725, give the 3 independents the amount they requested and then distribute the remainder among the other CTEs. But the communications have been very hard to understand. And so we're struggling with how to resolve this in the best way possible. Okay, I never miss an opportunity to put out an issue, but obviously that's much more time sensitive than the 23 budget. So any further questions on B501? I don't see any, so we'll keep going.
All right. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And again, this is just a different slice of the information that we shared, very similar to B500, breaking down the category of expenditure by personal service, operating expense, and grants. And then
Could
this
you
is all.
explain your 14, go back on, that's a fairly big increase. 13, almost 14 million on personal services. That's more than adding a couple positions.
Absolutely. And the bulk of that is $12.9 million, and that is contract changes that are associated with federal emergency funds. But because of the way that we group contracts, it falls under personal service. And so that is what you're seeing is the bulk of that increase, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Next slide is just again showing you the breakdown of the budget based on source of funds, and you can see for B501, 199,000 is related to a general fund. And then
190 million, right?
sorry, thank you for that, Secretary. And then, Madam Chair, we do have the ups and downs. If you and the committee are so interested in taking a look at the agency's ups and downs document, or we can turn it over to Brad James, who will talk to us briefly about Ed Fund.
I think we should, I think you've sort of done some of the ups and downs as you've gone through.
Yes.
What you've taken is extracted the,
Yes.
the key lines from the ups and downs. And so I don't see that we need to do that again unless the committee has got questions. Otherwise, the big money is out in the Ed Fund. So
Yes.
shall we go to Brad then? Unless there are further questions on the slides so far? I don't see any. So
Thank you,
why don't we
Madam.
go on to the Ed Fund?
Okay, Brad James, Agency of Education. It's nice to see everyone. So this is, again, basically it boils down to an ups and downs type thing. There's no change in personal service. I'm just going to kind of scroll down right through it. Operating expenses are up roughly $55 million, and I believe that those have to do with the vision payments and what else was it in the Ed Fund bill? There's vision payments and one of the lines.
Single audit.
Single audit. Those don't fall into my wheelhouse, so I always have to question, wonder what they are, or ask.
What about the common chart of accounts?
The chart of accounts is moving forward. The program, the e-finance program to collect the data is having issues. Chart of accounts, most districts are using it. I talked to the person who's more involved with than I am, who works for me, and well over half the school districts are using the common chart of accounts. When they are sending data into us, they are crosswalking, those who are not currently using are crosswalking to the chart of accounts. It's coming in as the chart of accounts. One of the things that happened in the past was that the chart of accounts was tied to the, I guess it's the SSDDMS state. I'm going to lose the acronym, or what it stands for.
Shared school district data management.
Thank you. I mean, again, that's where the issue is, and what the way it was set up was that as people came onto that, then they moved into the uniform chart of accounts. They could have moved into the uniform chart of accounts before, but people were thinking that it was easier to do it all at once. So I think the major problem was we tied the two together. And because they really don't need to be tied together, but we did the way it was laid out. And so the uniform chart of accounts is working. Not everybody's on it. People are looking to be on it. Some of the people who are not officially on it is because there was a change they have yet to update. So I'd probably say, based on the numbers, at least 2/3 of the districts are either on it or need to make one change so they're fully on it. So it is progressing slowly, but it is progressing.
Well, we put the money aside when Martha Heath chaired House Appropriations.
Mhm.
So it has been quite a while.
Mhm. It has. I agree. And I remember, again, I've not been directly involved in it. I do recall a lot of the discussions from, I think back to where they were happening, probably 9 years ago, something like that, where the business manager working with some people in AOE developing it. That process itself took time. And there was a lot of pushback, but they eventually got to that, and then it got tied in with the SSDDMS, and that's where I think things started to have more issues.
Okay.
But
So we're kind of
it is
at,
long.
so we're getting close to the end
Yeah,
of the transition.
I think so. I mean, I'll let Bill speak to the SSDDMS issue a little bit more because he's involved in it and I'm not. But it's
Well, we've extended, I guess, do we need to extend it again? We had some language that we did, it was necessary. I guess my question is, do we need to do anything at this point?
It's being put on pause, Madam Chair, and I'll let Bill take over from there because I'll be out of my wheelhouse and I'll start saying one thing if I say much.
Well, I don't want to do that to you. I just was wondering.
Thank you. I'll let Bill. Bill can answer that.
Okay, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought heard somebody say, "Oh, we need another extension."
Yes, Madam Chair, that is correct. And so the Uniform Chart of Accounts, we're separating that from the SSDDMS, which is the General Ledger implementation. And I just had a conversation earlier this afternoon with the project team, and they were actually going to be communicating with the 2 or 3 vendors that other districts are on that where they have not migrated over to the Uniform Chart of Accounts to have discussions as to how long will it take to get their coding in place so that their districts can migrate over to the Uniform Chart of Accounts. And we're shooting for July 1st for as many of those as possible. As far as SSDDMS, which is the General Ledger component, we are recommending that we form a study committee and come back to the General Assembly in early January 23 with recommendations. We have formed a work group which consists of HR professionals, business managers, as well as agency of ed and IT resources. They have worked well together. They've been meeting for about 2 months, and their recommendation was, given the short window, the best thing we could do is not rush this, recommend to the General Assembly that we form a study committee. I'm working with Representative Conlon on making sure that we get that draft language in place so that we can make that happen. And then we would come back with a recommendation as to what do we do with the General Ledger, knowing that the Uniform Chart of Accounts is going to be adopted by all, and then that would leave it up to the districts as to what system they're going to be using and how to proceed. And we're happy to come in if there is a time in the schedule. Happy to reach out and partner and have a presentation so that you can hear the SSDDMS update, which would involve the business managers as well as HR professionals and the agency.
Well, thank you for the offer. I'm not sure I need to get into that level of detail. I just wanted to get an update on where we were and what the next steps would be. So if there's more desire to drill down on that, I will ask Senator Baruth to, if he feels it's necessary, but and we'll look at the language that's being developed in the House. Since they only have one committee, they've probably got more time to really spend on it. Okay, so with ed fund expend, I'm sorry, Brad, we kind of got off here.
That's okay. I fully expected that question to come up at some point, so I think we all did. So back to education fund expenses now. Number, I guess that's line 4, technical education. We are looking to increase by about roughly $740,000. That's based on, that goes to salary assistance, and it's based on information from the districts, or it's based on estimates because we don't know what people are doing yet. We usually put in like a 5% growth or something like that. Quite often we're wrong, and so we revert the money back at the end of the year when we don't use it all. But we try to make it sure that it's a little bit higher than what they're going to really need. But we find out after the fact, so that's why that's going up roughly $740,000. Next line down is a special education formula. That's down about close to $21 million, and that's because we're going into the census block grant. The census block grant is based on their FY, and it's an average of their FY 18, 19, and 20 reimbursements per pupil. It's a formula in there and that's where we're going to, when you work through it, that's where that $208 million in the middle column comes out to be.
Is that what we're hearing from schools?
Yes, that's
okay.
right. That's exactly right where I was going. This is where people are saying that that it's not necessarily enough. Some districts seem to do better because they don't have as many kids with disabilities. Other districts are losing out is how they look at it. When that happens, what's happened is their costs aren't necessarily going down yet at this point, which is what we're hoping this will do eventually, but not at this point. What's happened is that when it's not covered by the special education fund block grant, so the revenues are down, it's spilling over into their education spending, which is going directly into their tax rate. I was in House Ed, I guess it was last Friday, perhaps. And they had asked what would happen if we moved that average from 2018, 19, and 20 up to an average of 2019, 20, and 21. And what that did is it basically based on very, very rough gross estimates, it basically put another $4 to $4.5 million into the funding, which helped everybody. On average, I think it was, again, very gross, rough numbers. It was about $75 to $80. I think it was $77 per ADM, which is how the grant goes out. So that may get traction in the House, just so you're all aware of it if you had not heard. So that will impact that number there probably.
Brad?
Yes.
If I might, Madam Chair.
Yes, certainly.
So I'm wondering about compensatory education for special ed. I had assumed, and I think, a lot of people had assumed that given that we went to remote formats, people who were on specialized plans often couldn't get, the actuality of the plan because we were locked down or there were other health-based reasons why those plans had to be in effect suspended. And my understanding was that federal law guaranteed a compensatory aspect once we came back into a space where we were able to provide it. So I understand the $20 million down given the block grant coming into effect. Can you give me any insight into, did that compensatory piece ever come into play? And did that increase cost?
I think overall we're going to see an increase in cost. I think service plans are up, and that's what I've been hearing from people, from business managers that I've been talking to about budgets and such. In terms of did that ever come into play, the compensatory, that's more on the programmatic side. I wonder if Secretary French is over there squirming, hoping that he can answer.
Yeah, I can chime in. Are you done, Brad, or do you want me to?
Please take over.
Okay, yeah. I would draw the distinction, I think, between what we call compensatory services and extended school year services. So to your question, Senator Bruce, compensatory services are not necessarily obligatory. They're usually awarded as a result of due process, that it was determined that a student should have and now is entitled to.
So people have to complain or
that's correct.
Sue the district.
Yeah, and extended school year services, on the other hand, are basically an IEP team decision. So if a student, it's determined a student would benefit and needs additional services beyond the regular school year, then there's a mechanism called extended school year by which that programming is put together. So I can just describe that phenomena. I don't have detailed numbers in front of me as to what extent that's been a pattern, but we do have quite a bit of guidance that we've had to produce over the last year or so on these issues to help the field move forward.
So where would that spending for an extended school year, which bucket here would that fall into?
I believe it would show up under special education. It's a regular
Okay.
reimbursable expense, I believe. But Brad?
Yeah, I think so, unless it's being covered by federal money, at which point it wouldn't show up in here.
Right.
Well, that could be true as well, that they would have additional federal revenue.
Right, because my understanding, again, this is pretty much out of my realm. My understanding is that a lot of them are using some of the federal ESSER monies for that, so it wouldn't show up here.
Mhm.
But if it spills over, it will be showing up in the ed fund.
And
Okay.
I can add just a little bit more on that, and Chris could also address this. In addition to the ESSER funds, the Department of Education also increased what they've called the ARP IDEA. So in addition to the usual IDEA funds, there's been a significant additional funding source to address those needs. And that goes through 2024.
Great,
Yeah, it's a
thank
good
you.
point.
Other questions or? All right, well, you can see this is the big money, 1.852.
Right, and this is jumping ahead, but on the other side of this coin is there's a large carry forward on the special ed line. And that's because moving from the reimbursement model to the block grant, there is that last quarter payment, which happens in the following fiscal year. So we're carrying forward quite a bit of money to make sure that we have enough money for that so that we don't have to appropriate more money, because the way the federal maintenance of effort works is they look at what you're appropriating. So if we're carrying forward money, we don't have to appropriate additional money to pay that. So that's kind of why that number is so large further on in the presentation.
I know you haven't gotten there yet, but I'm looking at small school support. Is that small school grants? Is it?
It's small school grants and it's merged support grants kind of mixed in.
Yeah.
I still call them all small school support grant, which is not technically correct. But the legislation that passed right towards the end of the session, I think last year, by Ways and Means, said that it changed it. It said that if you're getting a small schools grant in FY20, that's what you get moving forward. That took care of most people who are getting small schools grants. There are still some districts that their population is going down that will be eligible. That's why there's a little bit more money in there. But it does cover, you're correct, Senator Bruce, it covers small school grants and it covers the merger support grants,
Okay, great.
which were from Act 46 that people forgot when people merged.
I didn't forget.
Okay.
Oh, did you forget that?
No.
Probably not. I don't remember many acts, but I do remember Act 60. That's one. Act 250, but depends on the year. Okay, other questions in terms of the ed fund? Okay, thank you. More slides?
Yeah, Brad, are there others that you want to highlight?
I don't think so. I mean, I'll talk to this one just a little bit. I mean, this is kind of the slide we have in there is cost drivers, and a lot of it has to do with the pupil count is decreasing, whereas the staffing is not decreasing at the same rate. So with an increase, with upward pressure of salaries and benefits, that's kind of pushing some of this along too. We still have roughly the same number of buildings that we had before. A few have closed, but we haven't lost a whole lot. So when you have buildings, as Bill Talbot used to say, if you have buildings, you need people. And so there's that happening too. And lastly, and pretty critically, that's with the pandemic going on, is that there are more children now who are living in adversity and they're needing higher services and more services. And so that's I think driving some of the costs too. This is just showing changes in education spending. The FY23 is that's the number that we came up with, about $1.9 billion. We're just collecting preliminary budget data right now. I had the first run that I talked to Ways and Means today. When we were doing estimates for the December 1 letter from the tax commissioner that recommends the yields, I was using an inflation of roughly 4.3 across the board not across the board, but for the state for education spending, which went into that tax commissioner's letter. Based on what I've seen as of yesterday, it's closer to 5%. Usually they come in a little bit higher and start to come down, but I don't know what's happening this year. It's an interesting year. So I'll be keeping a close eye on that and being in touch with Ways and Means quite a bit as we progress.
So that 2.7 you're thinking is going to be higher?
It might be. I don't think it's going to be significantly higher. One of the things that I was asked to do is if everybody came in at about the 5%, 5.1%, whatever it was, what would that increase be? And I haven't calculated that yet, but that would probably push it up a little bit. Yes.
Okay.
And I understand that, this is a concern for everyone. But as I said, generally speaking, we usually start at a high percentage, and as more people come in, it tends to decrease.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see what happens. So there are a lot of people who have large education spending amounts who have not reported yet. There's some of the higher ones. So we'll see what they say. Okay, Bill. Unless there are other questions on that one. These are just the carry forwards. That first line, there's that large number I mentioned, special education coming forward. I don't know how much we're going to use because the numbers seem fairly volatile. They may be more volatile this year. Whatever we don't use will come back to the ed fund. State place students, that's another one where we usually have trouble figuring out exactly what it is because that population moves. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. Lately it's been high. So we're doing that. Flexible pathways, I don't recall why we have that much into that we're carrying forward unless again we have more people coming in, which is a possibility because those numbers have been going up, I believe. And technical education, it's just help offset any increases we have, and again, revert what we don't use.
There, on technical education, there's a report that came out in June, and I think the CTEs hired Bill Talbot and Deb Brighton, and the agency hired its own consultants around how we fund CTE. Are any of the committees taking up that issue? Because it's been a perennial one in terms of our financing structure discourages kids from taking those courses.
I think, and Secretary French, you might have more information than I do. I think House Ed was looking at it, but I'm not sure they've taken it up and moved forward with anything. But I haven't been following that line too closely.
Yeah, we do have draft language in a bill. I want to say it's House Bill 483.
Okay.
There's a couple of issues here. It could be 377, but we have several issues relating to CT and workforce development that are priorities for the governor. But we do want to bring forward that work. To your question, Madam Chair, we did not contract with additional staff at the agency to take this work on. That's essentially what the bill is seeking to do, is to give the agency the ability to take the work that was done by Bill and Deb and actually turn that sort of analysis into an implementation recommendation. So there's some more work to do. That's what we'd like to do, but we think it's an important structural issue that needs to be addressed. So we agree in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been many years we've had this concern expressed that there's just because of the financial impact and the way in which it's financed, the sending high schools have concerns about sending students to the CTE programs.
Yeah, we look at any of the barriers that might exist to prevent students from accessing those programs. And I think we're focusing in on the funding system itself being a structural barrier.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly what we've been hearing for a long time. Other questions? Oh, guess not, huh?
Yeah.
I'm just looking. Any further questions? Obviously, there will be more. You have a proposal around what to do with the ed fund surplus. The governor does, and that would be taken up. I'm sure as we move along. Do you want to speak to that at all?
I think I'd prefer to bring that in on a formal conversation, and because we can have some written testimony we can introduce on that.
Okay, all right.
But it is, there's an interest again in workforce as being our priority, and we believe a significant role for CT in that regard.
Mm-hmm. I think our past legislation that we, would indicate the importance of CTE in that workforce need, and how we maximize those revenues and how we encourage the students to go in. And there's been historically sort of I don't even know how to express it, but I think diminishing the role or denigrating the role even of CTE, or if you go to those courses, not being encouraged or stereotyping the students who do. So it's there's a long legacy there left over from long before the creation of the CTE system in reality. And yet, if I look around in our area, some of the most successful businesses, and I'm sure their incomes are as equally as good as someone who might have graduated from, many of the colleges around, and they are the people that own the plumbing companies and the electrical companies and the plumbing. And so if you look at it in terms of workforce, you look at it in terms of economic advancement and opportunity, it's a very vital role. And maybe we can finally get it into a role that can discard some of this legacy here in terms of encouraging our kids. I got a lot of carpenters in my area that have degrees in English, believe it or not. Senator Baruth.
Yeah.
There is some utility in that degree, I understand, but it's immediacy escapes me. But anyway.
Well, I guess you can quote poetry or something while you're designing somebody's kitchen. So other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to suggest that we, it's almost 4, and that we adjourn the committee for today and thank our witnesses from the